They say every family has a price. Mine had mine figured out before I even knew I was for sale. My name is Tiara Lawson, and 2 months before my wedding, I sat across from my parents in their Buckhead penthouse, the kind of place that smells like fresh orchids and old money, and watched my mother fold her hands in her lap the way she always does when she's about to say something that should break you but won't, because she's practiced it in the mirror first. My father stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atlanta's glittering skyline, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand like a prop in a play he'd been rehearsing his whole life. And my mother, Celeste Lawson, opened her perfectly lined lips and said, "Tiara, we used the wedding money. Your brother needed it more than you. You'll understand." She smiled when she said it. Actually smiled. I nodded. I said, "Okay, Mom." I even reached across the marble coffee table and touched her hand. What I did not tell her, what I have never told anyone until right now, is that I had been waiting for exactly this moment for 3 years. Let me back up, because you need to understand what kind of family we're talking about before you understand what kind of woman I had to become to survive them. The Lawsons are Atlanta royalty, or at least they perform royalty the way certain people perform Christianity, loudly, publicly, and with absolutely zero conviction behind closed doors. My father, Ronald Lawson, built his fortune in commercial real estate development. He's the kind of man who gets his name on hospital wings but forgets to call his daughter on her birthday. My mother, Celeste, was a socialite who married up and never let a single person forget it. She wore St. John's suits to school kick-up and served on the boards of 3 nonprofits she'd never actually visited. She had opinions about wine vintages and none about her children's actual feelings. They had 2 children, my brother, Brent, who was the sun the whole family orbited, and me, Tiara, who was apparently the planet nobody charted. Brent is 31. He's never held a job for longer than 14 months. He's had 3 failed business ventures that my parents funded without blinking, a nightclub concept in Midtown that lasted 8 months, a sports management company that signed exactly 1 semi-professional soccer player before dissolving, and a lifestyle brand that produced 17 Instagram posts and nothing else. Every time Brent crashed, my parents caught him with open arms, open checkbooks, and zero questions. Every time I succeeded, they nodded and moved the conversation back to Brent. I am a corporate attorney. I made partner at 32 at one of Atlanta's most competitive firms. I paid off my own law school loans. I drove myself to every achievement like I was running from something, because I was. I was running from becoming invisible in my own family. Here's the hook nobody tells you about being the responsible one. They don't reward you. They use you. I had been saving for my own wedding for 4 years, not because my parents couldn't afford to contribute. They absolutely could. They had a vacation home in Hilton Head, but because I stopped asking my parents for money at 24 when I realized every dollar they gave came with a surveillance system attached. I wanted a wedding that was mine, funded by me, owned by me. No leverage. So I saved $180,000 in a family account that my mother had co-signing access to from years ago when I was in law school, an account I had stupidly never bothered to change, because who changes their account over their mother? Who thinks their mother needs to be protected against? I do now. They had taken $163,000, left me $17,000 and a smile. "Brent's new venture is really going to take off this time," my mother said that evening, sipping her Chardonnay like we were discussing the weather. "He found investors in Dubai. He just needed seed money to look credible. You know how it is." I did not know how it was. What I knew was that my wedding was in 63 days, and the venue I had booked, a historic estate in Buckhead with a guest list of 200, required a final payment in 3 weeks. What I knew was that the florist, the caterer, the string quartet, the custom Vera Wang-inspired gown, all of it was resting on money that no longer existed. My fiancé, Cade Whitfield, was waiting for me downstairs in the car. Cade is a cardiovascular surgeon, quiet, steady, the kind of man who shows up. He grew up in Charleston in a family with exactly none of the dysfunction of mine, which means he fundamentally could not believe how mine operated until I started showing him receipts. Literally, I would screenshot conversations and email them to him sometimes just so I didn't feel insane. He had wanted to confront my parents the moment I told him. I made him promise not to, because I already had a plan. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because I didn't come apart. I didn't cry. I didn't call my best friend Simone and scream into the phone. I drove home from my parents' penthouse with the windows down and the Atlanta heat wrapping around me like a reminder that I was alive and awake and 3 years ahead of this moment already. I want you to understand something about me. I am very good at appearing to accept things I have absolutely no intention of accepting. The plan had started 3 years ago, not because I predicted they'd steal my wedding money specifically, but because I had seen enough patterns to know that something like this was coming. It always did with families like mine. Families where one child is the golden one and one is the functional one, where the functional one's only job is to keep performing so the family can keep consuming. I had watched my cousin Petra get her inheritance quietly redirected to her brother's mortgage. I had watched my college roommate Danielle get guilted into co-signing her parents' vacation condo and spend 4 years paying a debt that was never hers. I had done enough estate litigation at my firm to understand with clinical precision exactly how families like the Lawsons operated, and I had spent 3 years making myself a very specific kind of ready. 18 months before the wedding money conversation, I had quietly begun moving the most important parts of my life out of my family's orbit. I opened a new personal account at a different bank, one my mother had no connection to. I consulted a financial planner who had absolutely no relationship with my father. I very subtly began untangling the small, creeping financial connections my family had to my life. A car insurance policy that was somehow still under my dad's umbrella, a health insurance crossover from a decade ago, things I had let slide because it felt like it would cause conflict to address them. I addressed every single one, quietly, over 18 months, like diffusing a bomb wire by wire so nobody hears the click. But here's what none of them knew, and this is the part that changes everything. 6 months before my wedding, I had found something I was never supposed to find, something that meant my revenge didn't just have to be personal, it could be surgical. Let me tell you about the Hilton Head house first. My parents' vacation home in Hilton Head is a 7-bedroom coastal estate. It is, on paper, jointly owned by Ronald and Celeste Lawson. It is worth approximately $4.2 million. I know this because I am a real estate attorney by specialty, and I pulled the deed as part of an estate planning conversation my father had invited me into because, again, I am the functional child, and when paperwork needs to be handled intelligently, suddenly I exist. I pulled the deed, and I noticed something. A lien. A quiet, almost elegant lien placed on the property 18 months prior by a private LLC called Coastal Meridian Holdings. The lien was for $890,000. I recognized the LLC immediately, not because I'd seen it before, but because I recognized the registered agent's name, a woman named Petra, not my cousin Petra, a different Petra, Petra Solis, 38 years old, registered address in Savannah, Georgia. My father had a second family. Not a fling, not an affair in the traditional sense, a full, structured, parallel life. A woman named Petra Solis, a daughter who was 14 years old, a townhouse in Savannah's historic district, and a private LLC that my father had been funneling money through for 11 years. The lien on the Hilton Head house was collateral for a private loan Petra Solis had extended to my father when one of his commercial developments hit a liquidity crisis 2 years ago. She had loaned him nearly $1 million. He had put the family vacation home as collateral without telling my mother. I sat with this information for 6 months. I told no one. Not Cade, not Simone, no one. I filed it like a brief. I built the case. I gathered every document I could access through legitimate legal channels: deed records, LLC filings, property tax records, court filings, all of it public record if you know where to look, and I know exactly where to look. I built a folder. I labeled it something boring so nobody would ever think to open it. I kept it in the cloud. I kept a copy at my office. I kept a copy with my estate attorney, sealed, with instructions. And then I waited for my parents to show me who they were one final, undeniable time. They delivered right on schedule. Now, here is where Cade comes in, because you need to understand the wedding situation fully before part 2 reveals what actually happened. When I got home that night and told Cade about the money, he went very still. Cade is not a loud man. He processes like a surgeon. He gets quiet and precise when he's the most upset. He sat at our kitchen island in our midtown condo and looked at me for a long time. "Tell me what you need," he said finally. That's Cade. Not "I told you so," not "your family is insane," just "tell me what you need." What I needed was for him to trust me completely for the next 63 days without asking too many questions. He agreed. This is why I'm marrying this man. Here is what I did in the 63 days between the money conversation and the wedding. I called the Buckhead estate venue and told them we were downsizing for personal reasons. I ate the deposit, $22,000, which hurt but was calculable. I contacted a wedding planner named Brooke Tanner, someone who owed me a significant professional favor from a contract dispute I had resolved for her firm 2 years ago. Brooke didn't just plan weddings. Brooke had connections I needed. I told her what I was building. She looked at me across her West Midtown studio and said, "Tiara Lawson, you are the most composed person I have ever met." I told her composed doesn't mean unaffected. She got to work. I kept up appearances with my parents completely. I went to Sunday dinners. I let my mother talk about the flowers she was excited to see at my wedding. I smiled. I confirmed details. I mailed them an invitation to the original venue address. I gave them the parking information. I told them the ceremony was at 4 o'clock. All of it was accurate. Accurate to the decoy. You're probably wondering about the private island. Let me explain Cade's family for a second, because this is where the story opens up in a direction nobody saw coming. Cade's uncle, Dr. Harlan Whitfield, is 72 years old, semi-retired, and owns a private island off the Georgia coast near Brunswick, about an hour and a half from Atlanta by car, plus a short boat transfer. It's not large as private islands go, maybe 12 acres, but it has a main house, a ceremony lawn facing the water, and enough logistics infrastructure to host an intimate event if you plan far enough ahead. Harlan Whitfield adored Cade. He had offered the island for the wedding as a gift 18 months earlier. Cade and I had originally planned to use the Buckhead estate because it fit 200 guests, but 200 guests was my parents' number, not mine. My real number, the people I actually love, who actually showed up for me in this life, was 43 people. 43 people fit on an island perfectly. I had been quietly planning 2 weddings since the moment my parents offered me access to the island, and I said, "I'll think about it." I thought about it. I planned it fully. I paid for it from the untouched account. I arranged the boat transfers from Brunswick. I arranged catering through a private chef Brooke knew. I arranged flowers through a Savannah florist who did the most extraordinary coastal arrangements I had ever seen. I had my dress, not the original venue gown, but a different one, a silk halter with hand-beaded detailing that I had found at a small bridal atelier in Charleston that made me feel, when I put it on, like I had finally arrived somewhere I actually belonged. And I made absolutely certain that my parents' names were not on the list. Wait, I know what you're thinking. You think the whole story is just the island reveal. The look on their faces, the pale, gutted expressions when they show up to an empty venue and get redirected. That's not even the best part. The best part is what I put in the envelope. But I'm not telling you that yet, because the envelope is part two's business, and part two is where the Lawson family learns in exquisite detail that the wrong daughter has been underestimated for the last 34 years. What I will tell you is this. On the morning of my wedding day, I woke up at 5:47 a.m. in a guest room on Harlan Whitfield's Island with the sound of water everywhere, low tide pulling back from the marsh grass, birds I didn't know the names of calling across the gray-pink sky. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt clean. Not happy in the frantic, performed way my mother would have wanted me to feel, surrounded by her friends and her flower opinions and her centerpiece commentary. Just clean, like something that had been pressing on my chest for a decade had finally lifted. Simone was already awake when I came downstairs. She had a cup of coffee waiting. She looked at me and said, "You doing okay?" I said, "Simone, I am so much better than okay that there's no word for it yet." She laughed and handed me the coffee and didn't ask any more questions because Simone has known me since Howard University, and she has seen me at my worst, and she knew this moment was earned. At that exact moment, 38 miles away in Buckhead, my parents and my brother Brent were parking their cars in the lot of an estate that would shortly inform them, via a valet coordinator I had specifically hired for this purpose, that the Lawson Whitfield wedding had been relocated. The coordinator would hand them a card, cream cardstock, my handwriting, the kind of formal presentation my mother would immediately clock as intentional, with the new address, and an envelope, sealed. My mother would open it before they even got back in the car. I know her. She cannot wait. She cannot sit with sealed things. The drive to Brunswick would be 1 hour and 22 minutes. They would have a lot of time to think about what was in that envelope. Here's what I can tell you about the envelope right now, without giving everything away. It was not a letter. It wasn't a long, emotional speech. It wasn't me working through years of grief in prose form. I am a lawyer. I don't write letters. I write findings of fact. What was in that envelope was the beginning of the end of the version of the Lawson family that had existed for 34 years. My mother would read the first page and go pale. My father would read the second page and go completely silent. And Brent would read the third page and realize for the first time in his life that the money he'd received had not been a gift. It had been borrowed against something, and the something was now in my hands. But that's part two, and part two starts at the moment they step off that boat. What I want you to hold on to as part one closes is this. The moment I stood in front of the water at 4:02 p.m., 43 of my favorite people arranged around me in white chairs on a ceremony lawn that smelled like salts and gardenias, and Cade walked toward me from the main house looking like everything I had decided I deserved. That moment was not about revenge. Revenge was the envelope. The ceremony was for me. My father had a favorite phrase he used whenever something went wrong. "You don't get everything you want, Tiara. That's life." He said it when I didn't make varsity in 9th grade. He said it when I didn't get into my first choice law school. He said it when Brent's nightclub closed, and somehow I was supposed to feel consoled by its failure, as if shared disappointment was a form of love. He was right that you don't get everything you want. He was wrong about who that rule applied to. On my wedding day, with the Georgia coast spreading out behind me like a painting, with Cade's hands steady around me, with Simone crying beautifully in the front row, and Harlan Whitfield beaming like a man who had just watched justice arrange itself into flowers, I got exactly what I wanted. The question is what my parents found when they got off that boat, and whether any of them saw it coming. They didn't, not even close. The boat from Brunswick to Harlan Whitfield's Island takes 11 minutes. I know this because I had taken it 6 times during the planning process, timing it on my phone, watching the shore recede, feeling the particular quality of silence that only exists on water. 11 minutes is long enough to think, long enough to read something twice, long enough to feel the full weight of what you're holding in your hands, and understand that there's no undoing it. My parents had 47 minutes in the car from Buckhead to Brunswick, plus 11 minutes on the boat. 58 minutes with the envelope. My mother reads fast. She's a meticulous, anxious reader who goes over things multiple times looking for angles. I had written the contents of that envelope knowing exactly how she would read it. I had written it the way I write a legal brief, sequenced for maximum impact, front-loaded with undeniable evidence, followed by implication, followed by the one sentence at the end that makes every preceding sentence retroactively devastating. By the time they stepped off that boat, they had read everything 3 times. I know this because I watched their faces from the ceremony lawn, where I was still standing in my dress with a glass of champagne in my hand, surrounded by my 43 people at 5:17 p.m., 1 hour and 15 minutes after Cade and I had said our vows over the sound of the water. Cade's hand was at the small of my back, Simone was beside me, and I watched my parents and my brother walk up the wooden dock path toward the lawn, and I watched their faces, the way you watch a verdict being read. My mother's face was the color of old paper. My father was holding the envelope still, just carrying it at his side, like he didn't know what else to do with it. Brent was walking behind them with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not the usual loose entitlement, something tighter, something that looked, if I had to name it, like fear. They went pale, all 3 of them, pale, at the edge of my wedding reception, and I raised my champagne glass at them from across the lawn. Let me tell you what was in the envelope, because you have waited long enough, and the truth is wilder than anything I could have stretched it into. Page 1 was a single document, a certified copy of the deed to the Hilton Head property with the lien from Coastal Meridian Holdings highlighted. Beneath it, a 1-paragraph summary in plain language. The property Ronald Lawson had told Celeste Lawson she co-owned equally was encumbered by an $890,000 private lien placed without Celeste's knowledge or consent. Under Georgia law, this constituted fraudulent encumbrance of marital property. I had included the relevant statute. I always include the relevant statute. Page 2 was a printed summary of Petra Solis, public records only, nothing I had obtained improperly, nothing that could be characterized as invasion of privacy. Property records, LLC filings, 11 years of a Savannah address under a company name tied to my father's email domain, which was itself part of a court filing from a commercial dispute 2 years ago that was entirely public record. Included with this was a photograph, not a private photograph, a photograph from a Savannah Neighborhood Association newsletter publicly posted on their website, showing Petra Solis and a teenage girl at a community garden event. The caption identified them by name. The girl's last name was Lawson Solis. My father's name was in a hyphen in his other daughter's surname, and I wonder sometimes if he thought that made it sentimental or just convenient. Page 3 was for Brent. Page 3 was a loan document, specifically a promissory note, signed by Brent Lawson, co-signed by Ronald Lawson, for $163,000. The loan had been structured privately, but properly, by me, using a legitimate document template, and it had been mailed to Brent 6 weeks before the wedding, with a cover letter explaining that the funds my parents had transferred from my account constituted a personal loan from me to him, with an interest rate of 4.2% and a repayment schedule beginning 90 days from the date of the letter. The cover letter had been signed, dated, and sent via certified mail with return receipt. Brent had signed for it. He had never read it, which I had anticipated, because Brent does not read documents, but he had signed for the certified mail. That signature was on the receipt, and the promissory note, sent with that letter and never contested within the 30-day dispute window I had clearly specified, was now, under Georgia contract law, a binding legal instrument. Brent owed me $163,000 plus interest, with the first payment due in 2 weeks. My mother reached me first. She was trying to compose her face. I could see the effort, the muscle memory of social performance kicking in even in crisis, but her eyes were doing something they almost never do. They were wet, not crying, just wet, like the emotion had gotten as far as her eyes and couldn't quite figure out how to proceed from there. "Tiara," she said. Her voice was lower than usual. The performance register had dropped out of it. "Mom," I said. I kept my champagne glass. I kept my posture. I had practiced this in my bathroom mirror for a week. Not what I would say, because I didn't plan to say much, but how I would stand. I wanted to stand the way someone stands who has already won. The Hilton Head, you have to understand. Your father's development deal. I understand completely, I said. I'm a real estate attorney. I've understood the Hilton Head situation for 6 months. I included the document so you could understand it. My mother blinked. Something shifted in her face. Not shame, not yet, but the specific disorientation of a person who has never once considered that the quiet one was paying attention. "The wedding account," she started, "is addressed on page 3, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "You planned all of this." "I planned my wedding," I said. Everything else was documentation. My father reached me next, and this is the moment I want to sit inside for a minute, because Ronald Lawson is not a man who has ever, in my memory, looked small. He's 6'2" with the specific posture of a man who has never once doubted his right to take up space. He's held himself like a monument my entire life, and he walked up to me on that island lawn with the Georgia coast behind us and the late afternoon light doing something golden and cinematic across the water, and he looked small. The word kept arriving in my mind, and I kept accepting it. He looked small. He didn't try to explain Petrosolis. I give him that. He's not stupid, and he had 58 minutes to figure out that I already knew everything, which meant explanation was pointless. What he said was, "I should have told your mother." "Yes," I said. "I should have told you both." "Yes." "Tiara." He said my name like it was a question, like he was asking something he couldn't quite form. "Dad, I'm not going to make a scene at my wedding, but I need you to understand something. Mom is going to need an attorney. Not yours, her own. And I'm not going to be the one who tells her what to do next. That's between you and her. But she should know she has options." He looked at me like I was a stranger. The good kind of stranger, maybe. The kind you realize you should have introduced yourself to years ago. I turned away from him before he could say anything else, because I had said everything I needed to say, and I was at my own wedding, and there was champagne and Cade and the water and 43 people who loved me without conditions, and I was done performing patience for people who had never extended me the same courtesy. Brent found me near the water about 20 minutes later. Here is a thing about Brent. When everything else is stripped away, the entitlement, the performance, the sun god routine, he's actually just a person who was raised to believe the world owed him what my parents chose to give him, which means he's not entirely the villain. He's a product. I can understand a product without excusing it. "You really lawyered me," he said. He actually almost smiled when he said it. That surprised me. "I really lawyered you," I confirmed. "The promissory note thing," he started, "is legally binding. I know that's inconvenient, but Brent, I saved that money for 4 years. Every dollar of it was mine. You took it, or you allowed it to be taken, and now there's a mechanism for returning it. That's not punishment. That's just accounting." He looked out at the water. He was quiet for a while. "Where'd you find out about Dad's—" "Public records," I said. "I'm good at public records." He laughed once, a short, startled sound. "Does Cade know all of this?" "Cade knows everything. That's what a real partnership looks like." Brent went quiet again. Then he said something I genuinely did not expect. He said, "I never really saw you, Tiara. I never did. I'm sorry." He looked like he meant it in the unpolished, unperformed way of someone who has never had to apologize for anything serious and doesn't quite know the right shape of it. I said, "I know. Start seeing me now, and it counts for something. Here is what happened in the weeks after the wedding, because I promised you emotional justice, and I do not leave promises unresolved." My mother hired an attorney. She hired a woman named Rochelle Davenport, who was one of the best family law attorneys in Georgia, and who, it turned out, had been on the other side of one of my firm's cases 2 years prior, which meant I knew her reputation precisely. My mother was in good hands. Rochelle filed for legal separation within 10 days and had the Hilton Head property situation in front of a Fulton County judge within 3 weeks, arguing fraudulent encumbrance of marital property. My father, represented by his own counsel, was facing the very real possibility of losing his primary leverage asset, the commercial development reputation he'd spent 30 years building, if Celeste went public with the full picture of Petrosolis and the hidden parallel finances. They settled. I do not know the exact terms because it was not my case and not my business, and my mother did not owe me the details. What I do know is that the Hilton Head house was transferred entirely to my mother's name within 60 days. I know this because I checked the deed records. Habit. Brent made his first loan payment to me 3 days before it was due. A wire transfer, no note, no context, just the money, arriving in my account like a quiet, belated acknowledgement that some things have to be paid back eventually. He's made every payment since. We are not close, we are not enemies, we are, for the first time in my memory, something like equals, two adults in a complicated family figuring out who we are when the structures we were raised inside stop working. I can work with that. My father sent me a letter, handwritten, which surprised me because Ronald Lawson types everything. He said he was proud of me, not of what I'd done specifically, but of me. He said he understood if I needed distance. He said he was getting help, couples counseling, and separately individual therapy, something I don't think he'd ever done before. I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if anything is enough when you build a lie that size across 11 years. But I'm a person who believes in process, and therapy is a process, and I'm willing to watch and see. I wrote back, one paragraph. I said I appreciated the letter. I said I needed time. I said the door wasn't closed. I meant all 3 sentences. Cade and I honeymooned in Amalfi for 12 days. We ate seafood on terraces above the water. We slept without alarms. Cade, who is normally constitutionally incapable of being offline for more than 6 hours, left his phone in the room safe for 3 full days at one point. We talked. Really talked, the way you can only talk when you're someplace far enough from your actual life that your actual life becomes a story you're telling, rather than a thing that's happening to you. I told him things I'd never said out loud, about what it felt like to grow up sideways in my family. Not neglected, not abused, just perpetually off-center, perpetually auditioning for an audience that had already decided the other act was the main event. He listened. He didn't try to fix it or frame it or give it a silver lining. He just listened. And when I finished, he said, "I'm glad you survived them intact." Intact. The word sat in my chest for a long time, because here's the thing about being the functional one, the responsible one, the one who handles things. People assume you're intact by default. They assume competence is the same as wholeness. They mistake your capacity to manage the damage for proof that you weren't damaged. But you were. I was. I had spent years managing myself into something functional while quietly grieving something I couldn't even name. The simple experience of being chosen first, not second, not after Brent, not after the business needs, not after the family optics. First. Cade chose me first, always, without me having to ask. On the 9th day in Amalfi, on a terrace with a view that should have been illegal, I cried for about 20 minutes in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in years. Not the controlled, purposeful kind of emotional release I'd carefully managed through the whole preceding year, but the messy, wordless kind that doesn't have a reason except that you've been holding something heavy for a very long time and you've finally put it down. Cade sat next to me and didn't say a word. He handed me a linen napkin, the nice restaurant kind, which made me laugh through the tears, and held my hand and waited. That was the moment I felt it finally. Not just the justice, the rest of it. Here is what I want to tell you, if you're the kind of person who has been the functional one in your family. If you're the one who handles things, the one who doesn't ask for too much, the one who has been performing okay so long that everyone around you has accepted it as your permanent condition. They see your competence and they call it strength. Sometimes it is strength, but sometimes it is armor. And armor is not the same as being whole. Armor is what you build when you've learned that softness gets managed and weakness gets used and need gets redirected toward whoever the family has decided needs it more than you. The difference between armor and strength is that armor you wear, strength you become. I spent 34 years in armor. I spent one very specific, very deliberate year becoming something else. Not harder. Harder was never the point. The point was becoming someone who could not be quietly consumed, not because I had made myself unreachable, but because I had finally, fully decided that I was worth protecting. My marriage is not a revenge plot. My marriage is what I built while the revenge plot was running in the background. Cade is not a device in my story. Cade is the person I built a life with, the person who trusted me when I said, "Trust me," the person who sat on a boat to a private island in a suit that fit him perfectly and cried at our vows. Actually cried, not performative social tears, real ones, because he meant every word. The island was real. The ceremony was real. The 43 people who showed up were real. Everything else was just documentation. Simone asked me once, after everything settled, whether I felt guilty, whether the envelope had felt cruel. I thought about it honestly, the way I try to think about hard questions, without reaching for the answer that makes me look best. No, I said, but not because it wasn't hard for them. It was. I know it was. But Simone, my mother didn't know her husband had another family. She was going to find that out eventually. I just made sure she found out in a context where she had options, rather than in a context where he could control the narrative. My father needed to reckon with what he'd built. Brent needed to understand that there are actual consequences in the real world for taking things that aren't yours. I didn't destroy anyone. I just stopped absorbing the damage. Simone looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You know what the wildest part of this whole thing is?" "What?" "They raised you to be exactly the person who could do this to them." I thought about that for a long time afterward. She was right in a specific way. They had raised me to be competent, detail-oriented, quietly persistent, and accustomed to doing everything myself because no one was coming to help. They had raised me to function in the absence of support. They had raised me to manage complexity without complaint. Every quality they had accidentally forged in me by ignoring me, the precision, the patience, the capacity to hold a long game, I had turned around and used. They had built the instrument of their own reckoning and handed it to me and called it their good, quiet daughter. I was never quiet. I was just strategic. The last thing I want to tell you is this, because every story needs the moment where the whole shape of it becomes clear. 3 months after the wedding, I received a package. It came to my office, addressed in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. Inside was a small book, a collection of poems, the kind of slim paperback you find in a specific kind of independent bookshop, and a note. The note was from Petra Solis. She wrote, "I found out who you are through the attorney process. I want you to know that I did not know there was a family. I was told he was divorced. When I discovered the truth 4 years ago, I ended the personal relationship, but the financial entanglement was more complicated, as you know from the records. I am sorry for any role I played in your family's pain, even the unintentional one. Your father speaks of you. He always said you were the one who would land on her feet. He was right, from what I can see." I read the note twice. I thought about Petra Solis raising a daughter with a hyphenated last name, building a life on information that had been falsified, navigating a financial entanglement she hadn't designed and couldn't easily exit. I thought about how many of us in this story had been handed someone else's mess to live inside. I wrote back, short, clean. I said, "I don't hold you responsible for what you didn't know. I hope you and your daughter are well." I meant that too. Some things are complicated in ways that don't resolve into a villain. My father is the villain of his own story in ways that are his to reckon with. Petra Solis is just a woman who got lied to by the same man who lied to all of us.
and I can hold that without it complicating my justice. Kate and I bought a house in Inman Park last spring, a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors and a backyard that needed serious work, which we have been doing slowly, weekend by weekend, learning what we're doing as we go. It is not a Buckhead penthouse. It doesn't smell like orchids. It smells like old wood and coffee and whatever Kate is cooking on Saturday mornings, which is usually something ambitious and occasionally catastrophic and always made from scratch. My mother came for dinner last month, the first time she'd been to our home. She brought wine, a good bottle, nothing showy, which told me something about who she was becoming without the performance apparatus of her marriage. She looked at the house with genuine interest, asked real questions, complimented the floors without making it a comparison to anything she owned. We had dinner on the back porch. We didn't talk about Ronald, we talked about her, what she was thinking about doing now, whether she'd travel, whether she'd go back to her painting, which she'd abandoned 15 years ago when she decided her job was being Mrs. Ronald Lawson. She said, "I think I stopped being a person for a while." I said, "I think you can start again." She looked at me across the dinner table with the porch lights making everything soft, and she said, "How did I not see how extraordinary you were? How did I look right at you and not see it?"
I said, "You were looking at Brent." She was quiet a long time. Then, "I'm sorry, Tiara. I'm genuinely, completely sorry." I said, "I know, Mom. I know you are." And I meant it, both the acceptance of the apology and the awareness that sorry doesn't unsave the years. Both things were true. I have learned to hold two true things at once. It's one of the more useful skills a person can develop. My name is Tiara Lawson Whitfield. I'm a partner at a firm in Atlanta. I have a husband who cries at the right moments and burns things on the stove and shows up every single day. I have a best friend who knew when to pour the coffee and when to ask questions and when to just stand next to me in white chairs on an island lawn. I have a mother who is rediscovering herself at 61, which is not too late, which is never too late. I have a brother who is learning, slowly and imperfectly, that the world is not a vending machine calibrated to his need. I have a father doing the work of understanding the damage he built, and I am watching from a respectful distance to see whether the work takes. I have a house with original hardwood floors and a backyard that's getting there. I got my money back. I got my wedding. I got my whole life, actually, the real one, not the performance I'd been maintaining for the benefit of people who weren't paying close enough attention to deserve it. The island was not the revenge. The island was the reclamation. The documentation was the consequence. The clarity was the gift I gave myself after years of giving everything to people who called it owed. They said I'd understand, that he needed it more than me. Here's what I understand. Nobody needs it more than you when you're the one who earned it. And the best thing you can ever do with that understanding is refuse to let it make you small. Refuse to let it make you bitter. Refuse to let it make you quiet in the ways that actually matter. Instead, document everything. Know your worth to the dollar. Build something they can't touch. And when the time comes, send them to the right address. They'll find you eventually. Let them find you standing.
Quick check-in, where are you watching from? Drop it below and make sure to subscribe for upcoming stories. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. A new story is coming soon. Until then, stay strong and don't lose hope.